As you all know, we have the Paris Agreement, right? The climate agreement that entered into force in 2016 and established the salutary goals of seeking to hold temperatures to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius and at least aspirationally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, the way Paris works is that countries make pledges, so-called nationally determined contributions, and to effectuate that goal. And if you look at the gap between the pledges that have been made to date and achieving those temperature goals, it's yawning. And so more recent analysis indicates that instead of holding temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, we're on a glide path for somewhere between 2.4 to 2.9 degrees Celsius, maybe more by the end of the century. And if we get temperature increases of that magnitude, it's potentially catastrophic, both in terms of human institutions as well as ecosystems. If temperatures rise by somewhere between 1.7 to 2.3 degrees Celsius, we're likely to see the melting of the entire Greenland ice sheet. And this one ice sheet results in ultimately in sea level rise of about 7 meters, right? The good news is it takes 1,000 years. The bad news is that once it happens, we're essentially locked into that sea level rise for many, many, many thousands of years thereafter. If temperatures rise by 2 degrees Celsius, we're likely to lose all of the world's coral reefs, which provide critical sustenance for about 35% of all ocean-based species. If temperatures rise between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, there's a threat that the thermohaline ocean circulation belt, which circulates warm temperatures to Europe, could be shut down, essentially catapulting Europe into massive declines in temperature in the future. These kinds of increases in temperature could also result in massive losses of biodiversity, crop losses, and so forth. And so it is not surprising that given the fact that we've not gotten our act together in terms of reducing our emissions, that we're now looking at other options. And these options fall broadly can broadly be defined in the following ways. Geoengineering, which is the deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's natural system to counteract climate change. And when we talk about climate geoengineering, we usually broadly divide it into two major categories. The first of these categories is solar radiation modification, which is what we're going to talk about today. And these are efforts to reduce the amount of incoming solar radiation that can be trapped by greenhouse gases. And as a consequence, it exerts a cooling effect by reducing radiative forcing. The second major category is carbon dioxide removal, and these are efforts to actually reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that trap solar radiation. Okay? Now, until very recently, at least this first category, solar radiation management, was considered forbidden territory or taboo by most researchers and politicians. But largely out of desperation, we're starting to see an embrace, at least on the research side, right? So we see in 2023, the White House Office of Science and Technology calling for a research program in the United States, the European Commission also calling for research on solar radiation management, United Nations Environment Program, and so on and so forth. And in the United States, in recent years, we've had hearings on solar radiation management. We've got spending currently for a number of solar radiation management options. We have a major National Academy of Science study, right? So the drumbeats are there. And so what I want to do today is focus on solar radiation management, right? And I want to talk about several things, all of which I believe are impinged with ethical and justice questions. So first of all, I want to look at at four of the primary solar radiation management options that are being discussed. I want to look at their potential benefits as well as their potential risks on a number of different axes. And then second of all, and certainly pertinent from a standpoint of ethics, I want to talk about how do you govern a process that ultimately could have profound implications across boundaries as well as in the global commons, right? So let's start talking about some of these approaches. Now, if you've ever heard about solar radiation modification, probably the one that you've heard about is this first one, which is sulfur aerosol injection. Okay, so the idea of sulfur aerosol injection is to inject sulfate precursor gases into the atmosphere that then oxidize into sulfur dioxide, right? And sulfur dioxide ultimately it becomes sulfate particles that become highly reflective, right? And so they can reflect more incoming solar radiation back into space, right? And exert this cooling impact that we're talking about. And in this process, ultimately, it's been estimated that if we could reduce, through the injection of sulfur into the atmosphere, the incoming solar radiation by about 1.8%, and we call this insolation, that we could return temperatures back to pre-industrial levels, right? And that's the idea, and this is a time series of how ultimately that could occur, okay? Some proponents of this approach of sulfur aerosol injection indicate that there's empirical evidence that this could actually work. So, for example, in 1991, we had a major eruption of a volcano in the Philippines called Mount Pinatubo. And Mount Pinatubo at the time released about 18 teragrams of sulfur dioxide, about 35 kilometers into the stratosphere. And it had a dramatic impact in terms of temperatures. Within 6 months, temperatures on Earth fell by 0.5 degrees Celsius, which is extremely dramatic, right? And so proponents argue that this is evidence that this kind of approach can work, and it can work very quickly. Also, if we look historically, in the 540s, the 1450s, and the 1600s, times where we saw dramatic declines in temperature, they were also correlated with major volcanic events, right? So this is evidence that putting sulfur dioxide into the sky could have significant impacts in terms of cooling. Now, how much would we have to do at this time? Recent studies have indicated that ultimately, if we were to put somewhere between 5 and 20 teragrams of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere annually, we could return temperatures back to pre-industrial levels, right? And so that's the metric that's often talked about, okay? And one question is, how would you do that? How do you deliver that amount of sulfur dioxide? Currently, there's plans to develop high-altitude airplanes that could ultimately deliver the sulfur dioxide. Some proposals for weather balloons have been talked about, and some have talked about unmanned airships, right? But the delivery system is something that probably would take at least a decade, maybe a couple decades to be able to effectuate, right? Okay. Another reason that this approach is touted by some is cost. It's been estimated that it would cost about 1/100th what it would cost in terms of traditional mitigation to achieve the same levels of cooling, right? And so proponents indicate that that's, again, a benefit of this approach. However, as you can probably imagine, there are some risks in injecting huge amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, and so I want to talk about what those are. The first is in terms of precipitation. Okay, so if you put large amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere and ultimately cool the stratosphere, you're going to substantially reduce evaporation. And when you reduce evaporation, you're going to reduce precipitation, right? And it's going to happen in an uneven fashion, and it's probably going to happen regionally, right? And so some recent studies have indicated that in tropical regions, especially in Southeast Asia, this could result in a reduction of precipitation of about 30%, right? And what would that mean from a practical standpoint? A couple of recent studies have indicated that that reduction in precipitation could ultimately shut down the monsoon on a regular basis in Southeast Asia. And this is a phenomenon that's responsible for providing sustenance for about 1 billion people. Okay? And we're also worried that in certain other areas, including in South America, we could see Amazonian diebacks associated with this, and some also in areas of Africa. So precipitation is one of the things that we're worried about. On the other hand, what proponents of this approach respond is in two ways. First of all, they say that there's a trade-off, that whereas it might reduce precipitation, this approach would also decrease temperatures, which means soils would retain more moisture, and ultimately, from a standpoint of agricultural production, it might be a wash, okay? But again, this is all based on modeling at this point, so we clearly are not certain. The other thing they argue is a concept of peak shaving. What they say is, let's pretend that we're not going to try to return temperatures back to pre-industrial levels. If our goal is only to hold temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius, for example, then the amount of sulfur dioxide we'd have to introduce into the stratosphere would be substantially less, and as a consequence, it's likely that the precipitation impacts would be substantially less than what we see under this kind of full deployment sort of scenario. The problem, again, of course, is this is all based on modeling, and it's not terribly certain what would happen. The other issue in this context is if you wanted to hold temperatures to a certain level, you'd have to get the entire world community to agree that that was optimal, right? And that may not be possible once the genie is out of the bottle. Certain countries may find that more warming is advantageous because it can open up areas for exploration of minerals, for example, in Arctic regions, or it can open up new areas for agricultural production that may not have existed before, whereas other countries may want temperatures held to a much lower level, right? So this presumes in this kind of peak shaving scenario that the world obtains a consensus that we hitherto have not seen, including in the context of policymaking. A second thing that we're worried about is ozone depletion, right? What we know in terms of aerosol injections in this context is that halogen molecules, right, found in this area, ultimately transform into halogen radicals, right, and that effectuates this process of the breakdown of the ozone layer. What we also know is that if you inject substantial amounts of particles, including sulfur dioxide, into the stratosphere, it creates more of a stratus for those chemical reactions. And thus, the argument is that it could substantially accelerate the breakdown of the ozone layer in the stratosphere, right? So recent studies indicate that if you were to do this at a full scale, you potentially could have as much depletion of the ozone layer as we saw during the 1970s and the 1980s at the height of when humans were introducing ozone-depleting substances, including chlorofluorocarbons, into the atmosphere. Moreover, it could delay recovery of the ozone layer, which has now begun as a consequence of the Vienna and Montreal conventions, by as much as 50 to 70 years, right? And as a consequence, you could see millions of additional cases of skin cancer, large amounts of mortality associated with that, as well as aquatic ecosystem impacts. In response, proponents of this approach argue a couple of things. First of all, they argue, again, there's a trade-off. If you're introducing large amounts of sulfur dioxide, it's going to attenuate a lot of the incoming ultraviolet radiation. And they argue that attenuation and that dispersion, ultimately, of ultraviolet radiation might ultimately offset all of the increased ultraviolet radiation that could be introduced if the ozone layer is broken down. But again, all based on modeling. The second thing, of course, they argue is peak shaving, right? And if we put a lot less of this into the atmosphere, then there's going to be a lot less breakdown of the ozone layer in the long term. Some other potential impacts that would occur as a consequence of this. There's some speculation that it would denude the effectiveness of solar energy systems by reducing the amount of radiation. There's not too much research in that context. We're also worried about exacerbating acid rain, right? We know that sulfur dioxide in the troposphere, right, is a harmful pollutant. And ultimately, about 15% of the sulfur dioxide that you might introduce into the stratosphere would drop into the troposphere, and it would exacerbate acid rain, right? And it's been estimated that at full-scale deployment, this approach would result in an additional 3,000 deaths associated with acid rain. Proponents argue that that's a trade-off, that again, if you look at the impacts of unchecked climate change from a mortality standpoint, it's more than beneficial to allow this to happen. The last thing that we're worried about is something called the termination effect. And if that sounds bad, that's because it is, okay? So here's the idea. Let's say that you put all of this sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere and it creates this protective umbrella, right? And we're no longer feeling a lot of the manifestations of warming, okay? All good. Then what happens if all of a sudden you terminate the use of that approach, right? Well, the first thing you have to say is, well, why the heck would you do that, right? You've got this nice umbrella now. You're not feeling climate change. You might for two reasons. First of all, what happens if a future generation decides that it is inherently unethical to have certain areas of the world, such as Southeast Asia, facing massive famine as a consequence of deployment of these approaches, and we decide to stop using them, right? That's one way that we might no longer use this approach. A second is that we don't know if it will work in the long term, right? We have evidence from intermittent volcanic activity, right, that this approach is effective. But if you were deploying large amounts of sulfur dioxide iteratively, year after year, some recent research indicates that ultimately the particles would begin to become much larger and they would not have the same reflective impacts, right? And so it may be that the project simply fails. Well, what would happen if it failed, right? Ultimately, all of the buildup of carbon dioxide in the stratosphere, right, during this time in which we had this protective umbrella in place, would now manifest itself, right, in changes in terms of warming. And so recent research indicates that over the course of the first 11 years, you could see 3 to 4 degrees Celsius increases in temperatures, and over 20 years, you could see temperatures rise by somewhere between 6 to 10 degrees Celsius, right? To put that in perspective, that would be a rate of warming that's 20 times greater than a business as usual scenario in terms of climate change. Right? And catastrophic, to put it mildly, right? Human institutions, biological systems are not going to be able to adapt to rapid increases in temperature of that magnitude. Proponents respond in a couple of ways. Okay? One is they argue our old friend peak shaving, right? So if we use less of it, maybe we don't have this kind of termination effect. The other thing they argued that I don't find very encouraging or uplifting is, well, my God, we'd fry the earth, so we'll never stop using it, right? But the point is that if it fails, right, it won't matter, right, whether we want to use it or not, right? And it seems like a frail reed to lean on. But nonetheless, it is one of the arguments that's made. Second approach that we're looking at, we're moving down now, and this one is called marine cloud brightening, or MCB. So individual cloud droplets, right, form around microscopic particles called cloud condensation nuclei. And generally speaking, an increase in cloud condensation nuclei increases the number of cloud droplets, makes those droplets smaller, and hence makes the clouds brighter, right? They have more albedo, and they reflect more incoming radiation away, okay? So, and then through a phenomenon known as the Twomey effect, the high concentration of these droplets boosts the cloud's reflectivity. So sources of cloud condensation nuclei range from things like dust and pollen and soot and even bacteria, and along with man-made pollution from factories and ships. And so one of the reasons that we see highly white or reflective clouds in areas of high vessel traffic is as a consequence of this nature. So proponents of marine cloud brightening argue that what we should do is we should inject large amounts of sea salt, okay, by maritime clouds. And ultimately that sea salt would end up in the clouds, creating cloud condensation nuclei, creating more cloud droplets, and making these clouds much brighter, okay? And what they argue is that ultimately you could brighten these clouds enough to reduce insolation, incoming solar radiation, by about 1.8%, right? Again, returning temperatures back to pre-industrial levels. There's been people that have been ultimately researching this. Some researchers in Scotland believe that this is the approach. These are unmanned, GPS-guided spray vessels, right, that would be deployed throughout the oceans, and they would move and ultimately spray sea salt into clouds and effectuate the brightening that we're talking about. Now, potential risks of this approach. One, same thing that we're talking about when it comes to sulfur aerosol injection. Ultimately, if this effectuates substantial cooling, it's going to alter precipitation patterns, and in many ways, in similar ways to what we were talking about in sulfur aerosol injection. So we're worried about Southeast Asian monsoonal activities. We're worried about the Amazon and some areas of tropical Africa in terms of substantial reductions in precipitation. Another thing that we're worried about in this context is if you reduce the available light and ultimately cool ocean surfaces, right, you could have profound biogeochemical impacts in those areas, right? Could result in substantial reductions in phytoplankton, right, which are at the very base of the marine ecosystem, and other biogeochemical impacts that potentially could be extremely serious. Third approach, my favorite in some ways, space, right? So there's a number of these proposals that are out there, and one has even been in the news this week. So one thing that you could do is you could launch a rocket with a thin refractive shield, right? And that shield or space mirror would reflect incoming solar radiation back to space. This other illustration from the Asher Space Research Institute at the Technion is a proposal for parasols, right? And there'd be a number of these parasols that would be deployed into space to at least diffuse incoming solar radiation to reduce warming. And if you don't like those approaches, there's also two others. One is space frisbees, right? Instead of gigantic mirrors, you launch huge amounts of reflective mini mirrors into the atmosphere. Or you try to install cannons on the moon to release huge amounts of debris that would ultimately circulate and reflect sunlight away. Now, I see a lot of people smiling at this, but this is one of the ones your federal government is currently funding. Okay, so it's and the Israeli government in this case. There's lots of issues with this approach, right? One, it's costly, right? Probably cost about $5 trillion to start off with. But, you know, we've spent $5 trillion on a lot of other things, so it's possible. It would also take a long time. It's been some estimates that it might take as much as a century to be able to develop this kind of infrastructure, even if we could develop it, right? And of course, when we saw the news a couple days ago that the Russians are now working on approaches to nuke satellites in space, one of the things that we worry about is what would happen if either that was a threat or these these mirrors were hit by space debris or something else that ultimately rendered them ineffective. You would have the termination effect again, right? Where you'd all of a sudden instantaneously have massive pulses of heat, right? Proponents argue that one of the ways you could stop that is to have redundant systems in place, right, that you could quickly deploy, right? But it's questionable given the cost that we ultimately could do that. All right, one last one that we talk about. Now we get really close to Earth. This one's called cirrus cloud thinning. Right? And this goes the opposite way, right? Well, you know, cirrus clouds, right? Wispy clouds composed primarily of ice. The idea is that if you injected large amounts of ice crystals, you could ultimately decrease substantially the time these cirrus clouds stayed in space. Why would you want to do that? Well, what we know about cirrus clouds is that they trap a lot of outgoing radiation, so it can't escape back to space. And so the idea is if you reduce the amount of clouds, you essentially reverse the albedo effects we were talking about above, and more radiation escapes to space, and it exerts a cooling impact. This approach, in very early stages, we're not certain how effective it would be or effective at all. And again, we've got just a small amount of modeling at this point, so it's just difficult to know. All right, so that's a quick and dirty treatise of what some folks are thinking that we should do. The second question is, how do you govern it? Right? How do you govern things that potentially have impacts thousands of miles away and potentially profound impacts, right? And potentially lots of questions of distributive justice, right? Even if on balance the world community would be better off by deploying these approaches, given the fact that some people, many people potentially, could be worse off, how do you put governance in place and have the world comfortable that we should proceed with these? Well, to date, we've had two treaty regimes that have actually sought to regulate climate geoengineering. I just want to talk about what they've done first. Okay? So the first of these is a treaty called the London Protocol. So the London Protocol is a successor treaty to a treaty that was created in the 70s called the London Convention. And the London Convention was designed to prevent dumping of harmful materials into the world's oceans. And the protocol is a more sophisticated version of that treaty. So in 2013, the parties to the London Protocol amended the treaty to regulate, quote unquote, marine geoengineering. Okay, and they defined that term broadly. And what this treaty would do is it would initially regulate one kind of marine geoengineering, and this is a carbon removal approach. It's called ocean fertilization. This is a proposal to dump iron into the ocean to stimulate phytoplankton production and take up more carbon dioxide. So that's initially what they would regulate. And what they said is in this annex called Annex 4, anything that's regulated can only proceed in the following ways. First of all, it has to be small scale. Second of all, it has to be for scientific research purposes only, so no commercial motivation. And third, it's subject to risk assessment. Okay? And as I said, they initially placed in one of these, right, which was ocean fertilization, but now the parties have talked about adding other approaches, and two of them are solar radiation management approaches. One of them is one we've talked about, marine cloud brightening. The other one we didn't. It's microbubbles. It's this idea of generating huge amounts of bubbles on the world's ocean surfaces to make the oceans more reflective and to send more solar radiation back to space. And so the parties have indicated they may potentially want to regulate these in the ways that they are for ocean fertilization. Now, there are real limits to this approach under the protocol, however. First of all, this amendment to the treaty would only enter into force, meaning it would be legally binding, when 2/3 of the countries that are parties to this treaty, there's 53 parties, had agreed to it. And to date, only 6 have, right? So it's going to be a long time before this amendment is legally binding. Second of all, one small country is not a party to the protocol, and that's us, right? And a lot of this research associated with solar radiation management, probably comes as no surprise, is happening in the United States, right? And to the extent that we are not subject to this treaty, these regulations would not apply to any enterprise, whether it be the U.S. government or any private company under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. And then finally, another limitation is it's just related to marine interventions, right? So it's not going to regulate space mirrors, it's not going to regulate sulfur aerosol injection, it's probably not going to regulate even cirrus cloud thinning, right? So it's extremely limited in terms of its remit. Second treaty regime that's intervened is the Convention on Biological Diversity, right? And they, in 2010, essentially passed a resolution very similar to what the amendment to the London Protocol calls for. It says you can only do geoengineering if it's for scientific research purposes. You can't sell carbon credits or do anything of that sort, and it's subject to a risk assessment that has to be signed off by the country that has jurisdiction over the project. Okay. Limits to the Convention on Biological Diversity are as follows. One small country is not a party to it. That's us. Right? So again, if the U.S. government were to proceed, or anybody under U.S. jurisdiction, not subject to this. Second of all, this is a resolution or decision. It sounds impressive. It's a decision. Decisions of the Convention on Biological Diversity are not legally binding on the parties. Okay? Most of the time, they adhere to most of the provisions, most of the time. Okay? But not required. Okay, that's another major limitation. And third, the Convention on Biological Diversity, quite frankly, has sucked in terms of doing what it's supposed to do, which is protect biodiversity. So it'd be hard-pressed to argue that on this highly esoteric new mission, they're going to do a better job than they've done in actually protecting biodiversity. So when we're looking to move forward, we have to look at what other regimes might be able to exert effective jurisdiction. And probably the most logical one are the climate regimes, right? Because this is supposed to be a climate intervention, and so it would make sense for the climate regimes, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, to exert jurisdiction and regulate these approaches as part of a suite of responses to climate change, right? Mitigation, adaptation, and then this. Okay, so the first question, though, that you have to ask as a lawyer is: could the parties to the Paris Agreement assert jurisdiction over this approach? Are they authorized under the terms of the treaty to do so? Well, if you look at the treaty and you see what initially they can regulate under Article 4.1 of the Framework Convention, Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, it talks about mitigation measures, right? And it talks about reducing emissions, and it talks about enhancing sinks, right? So sinks are things that take up carbon dioxide. Right? So it's pretty easy to argue that under the Paris Agreement and the Framework Convention, they could regulate carbon removal approaches, one of the geoengineering approaches that we talked about. But not so clear that they could regulate solar radiation management, right? Because it does not involve reducing emissions or enhancing sinks, right? It involves reducing the amount of incoming solar radiation. Right? So by its terms, not clear that the parties have jurisdiction over this approach. There is some other language that we might be able to use, however, to make that argument. The Framework Convention in Article 3.1 says you're supposed to protect the climate system for future generations. You might argue that if solar radiation management had substantial impacts on the climate system, including precipitation changes of the nature we're talking about, that jurisdiction would lie. Under the Paris Agreement, interestingly enough, in the preamble, that's the introductory part of the agreement, it says that parties can be affected not only by climate change, but also by the impact of the measures taken in response to it. Right? And so one of the arguments you could make is, to the extent that solar radiation management is a response mechanism to climate change, the parties have the right to note concern and potentially regulate it. Okay? Now, this language here, the preamble, is not legally binding on the parties. It just guides them in terms of implementing the rest of the treaty. So that weakens that argument initially. But Article 4 also talks about the fact that your parties are to, quote, take into consideration the implementation of the agreement on parties with economies most affected by the impact of response measures, right? So again, one could argue that to the extent that these response measures would undermine economies by doing things like decreasing agricultural production or substantially increasing the health threats associated with ozone depletion, right, that the parties would have jurisdiction over these approaches. The other place where solar radiation management might play a role in the Paris Agreement is under Article 8, something called loss and damage. So loss and damage is an acknowledgement that there is large amounts of climate impacts that cannot be either mitigated or adapted, right? It acknowledges the fact that the levels of carbon dioxide have now reached a point in the atmosphere that a lot of the harms, no pun intended, are baked in, right? Or that adaptation is overwhelmed as a consequence of this. And so the loss and damage provisions, as you can see, seek to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. One of the arguments that could be made is that solar radiation management could be a method to minimize loss and damage, right? If we cannot minimize the harms associated with rising levels of greenhouse gas emissions and we can't adapt to it, solar radiation management, by holding temperatures below critical thresholds or helping us to bring temperatures back down, may be a method that could be argued to minimize loss and damage in the future. And again, it would be a mechanism that jurisdiction could be asserted for. Now, what would the architecture look like for this kind of approach? One thing that I would argue is that despite the risks that I've talked about, and they are serious, right, it probably still makes sense for society to proceed with research on these approaches. And the reason I think that's true, the primary reason I think that's true, is that the real fear is that in 20 or 30 years, if we start seeing massive manifestations of climate change, melting ice caps, huge increases in temperature, declining agricultural production, we may just panic because we know this stuff exists and just try something that turns out to really be catastrophic. Right? An argument could be made that what we should be doing now, even if we don't contemplate deploying these approaches, is research them, figure out which ones are just absolutely bat crap crazy and which ones may be tenable, right? And sort that out now. Okay? So that's one argument in favor of research. Another argument in favor of research is that we don't want countries unilaterally deploying these technologies and simply doing it in a way that's optimal for their climate, right? And so if we create an international research program, we may be able to start to engineer norms that ultimately make countries think more about collaboration and establishing an optimal approach for the world community as a whole that wouldn't have existed if we didn't do that, okay? So the question then is, where does the international research program happen? Well, it can't really happen inside of the Framework Convention or Paris because they don't really have mechanisms to do that, okay? And it can't happen with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change because they synthesize the results of research. They don't conduct research themselves. So probably the optimal approach would be a consortium of national research organizations. We have one of those in place right now. It's called, in a close context to this, the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, which is a consortium of countries that are looking at carbon capture and sequestration, which is capturing CO2 at the flue stack as opposed to the atmosphere, right? And that could create a framework in which this research could be conducted. One thing that would be critical, given the fact that there would be impacts potentially disproportionately in the global south, is that there is substantial global southern participation in these projects and capacity building. The other thing is that we could draw on the institutions of the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement to review these kinds of results, right? The scientific body of the Paris Agreement, the scientific body of the Framework Convention would have a role, as would the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In terms of guiding principles, one thing that should be a talisman is that we only seek to hold temperatures to where they are currently, or we seek to hold temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, but do not seek to return temperatures back to pre-industrial levels, right? And that's true, number one, because it's likely that the harms that would occur from a much smaller program are going to be much more minimal. And second of all, we want to provide an incentive for countries to continue to reduce their emissions. And the reason for that is one of the greatest concerns that we have about solar radiation management, which is what we call the moral hazard, right? If we believe we have a protective umbrella, will it be that the public no longer feels a need to exert pressure on the political process to address climate change? And would politicians, who heavily influenced by sectors such as the fossil fuel industry, take their foot off the pedal, what little foot there is there, right? And that would be catastrophic, because in the long term, if we don't substantially reduce our emissions, we would have to substantially increase the amount of solar radiation modification that we were doing to keep us at the same temperatures. And of course, the more we do that, the more we're playing with real fire in terms of all of these harms that we're talking about, right? So we want to limit what those objectives are. Ultimately, if we deploy then, we want to try to learn lessons from other treaties that would be potentially important in this context. We have a weather modification treaty, for example, that was created in the 1970s, right, that has provisions that would probably make sense to be incorporated in any kind of agreement to allow this kind of deployment. We have a convention that mandates environmental impact assessment, including transboundary environmental impact assessment, and provides rules for collaboration and participation by other countries that might be impacted by any unilateral efforts to deploy this kind of approach, and we'd clearly want that employed. We have an international convention that provides individuals with a right to access to information about major projects that are being proposed and access to judicial recourse if they're injured. And we would want to incorporate those kind of provisions into any kind of treaty. Ultimately, also, if we were deploying an approach of this nature, and we know that there would be winners and losers, we would want to have a system for compensation, right? Or we certainly could argue that there should be a system of compensation for those that were adversely impacted by this approach. And the preamble to the Framework Convention potentially gives us some grist to make that argument, right? It talks about the responsibility to ensure that activities within the jurisdiction or control of a party don't cause damage to the environment of other states or areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, right? And so one could argue that that's a hook for imposing liability in any case where there were harms associated with this approach. Now, there's a lot of limits to that you could probably imagine, right? One of them would be ascribing causality, right? We do have seasons in which the monsoon, for example, is weakened as a consequence of natural variability of the system, right? How do you prove that a weakening of the monsoon or a shutdown in any given year is associated with deployment of these approaches, right? What the world community would probably ultimately have to do is embrace something called absolute liability, right? Meaning that if the phenomena occurred, i.e. the monsoon was shut down, it would be agreed that compensation would ensue, right? And that we would not seek to establish causality, right? And that would be a principle of fairness. Another question we would have is a funding mechanism for this, right? Who's going to pay for the compensation? How do we allocate that compensation in the long term? And then, of course, the other question that lawyers don't ask, but normal people ask, is what does compensation mean when people die, for example, right? How much is your child worth in Bangladesh that has lost their life as a consequence of the shutdown of the monsoon, right? Lawyers come up with numbers for that, right? But the world community might not be as comfortable, right? But that's what we would potentially be looking at in this context, okay? So I'm going to stop there. To say the least, right, you can see all of the ethical issues, right, that would flow from this approach. But unfortunately, we have reached a point where I think we are going to be looking at this approach in earnest in the future, right? We've kind of seen the steps as time has gone on. Back in the 90s, one of the things that we talked about all the time is don't talk about adaptation, right? Because if we talk about adaptation, then we won't reduce our emissions as much as we have to, right? And by the time we got to the 2000s, we realized that was quaint, right? We weren't really going to mitigate enough, and we started talking about adaptation in earnest, right? Now, I run a carbon removal shop. We talk a lot about carbon removal, right? My guess is that we're never going to scale carbon removal up enough to be able to save our bacon either, right? Which means probably within a decade or 2 decades, in earnest, we're going to be looking at the possibility of deploying some of these approaches, right? And there are some potential benefits from doing that, given the fact that unchecked climate change is also obviously an existential threat to society, but there's also some potentially existential threats from this approach, right? And how we decide as a society whether to do this, how we decide what is consent, how we decide what is equitable governance, right, is going to be a momentous question, but nonetheless a question we're probably going to have to face. Thank you very much.